The space station called Nexus Keth 4 floated at the edge of known space like a metal beast waiting in the dark. And inside its walls lived thousands of aliens from hundreds of worlds who came there to trade and fight and survive in whatever way they could manage. Among all the species that walked those corridors, none were more feared than the Vorathi, and for good reason. They had earned that fear through countless generations of violence and conquest across 12 star systems. A Vorathi warrior stood 8 feet tall with muscles that rippled beneath skin as dark as the void between stars, and their claws could tear through starship hulls like paper, and their bioluminescent markings pulsed with light that told every creature nearby exactly how ready they were to kill. They were apex predators in every sense of the word, and they made sure the entire galaxy knew it. But on this day in the training grounds of the station, something was very wrong with one of their young. His name was Kaelvex, and he was born wrong by every standard his people held sacred. He stood barely 6 feet tall, which made him a giant by most species standards but a runt among his own kind, and his claws had never fully developed into the killing instruments they should have been, and his bioluminescent markings flickered weakly like dying stars instead of blazing with predator fire. The other Vorathi youth circled him now in the training pit, their markings pulsing bright with mockery and cruel excitement. Kethshar, one of them, snarled, and the others took up the chant. Kethshar meant hollow fang in their language, and it was the worst insult one could give to a Vorathi because it meant you were a predator with no bite, a hunter with no kill, a warrior who should never have been born. The largest of them was Thalrex, a young warrior whose markings blazed so bright they hurt to look at, and he stepped forward with his claws extended. "Let us see if the hollow fang can even bleed like a real Vorathi," he said with a laugh. The first slash caught Kale across the chest before he could move, and the pain was sharp and hot and familiar because this was not the first time and he knew it would not be the last. He tried to fight back, but his smaller frame and underdeveloped claws meant nothing against Thalrex's raw power, and within moments he was on the ground with blood pooling beneath him while the others laughed. The instructors watched from the edges of the pit with their arms crossed and their faces showing nothing because a defective predator was not worth protecting, and everyone knew that Kale would eventually be culled from the bloodline as all weak things were culled. This was the way of the Vorathi, and it had been their way for 10,000 years. But someone else was watching too. Commander Ilara Vance stood on the observation deck above the training grounds with her hands clasped behind her back, and her brown eyes taking in every detail of what was happening below. She was human, a species that most of the galaxy found strange and hard to understand. Humans were what the scientists called persistence predators, which meant they did not rely on strength or speed or venom to catch their prey, but instead simply followed it until it collapsed from exhaustion. Most aliens found this unsettling in a quiet way, but they also considered humans ultimately harmless compared to species like the Vorathi. Ilara had served 30 years in the human military forces that patrolled the outer edges of colonized space, and she had seen every kind of cruelty the galaxy had to offer. But something about watching this young Vorathi being torn apart by his own people made her jaw tight. She watched him struggle to his feet even after Thalrex knocked him down again, and she watched him raise his underdeveloped claws even though he knew he could not win. And she saw something in his eyes that the Vorathi apparently could not see. It was not weakness she saw there. It was fury, caged and burning and waiting for someone to give it a key. The beating continued for another 10 minutes until Kale could no longer stand, and then the young Vorathi left him bleeding in the pit while they went to celebrate their dominance elsewhere. Ilara made her way down from the observation deck and walked through the corridors until she reached the chambers where the Vorathi elders conducted their business. The patriarch of Clan Kethver sat on a throne made from the bones of conquered enemies, and his markings pulsed with ancient power as he addressed the gathered warriors. The one called Kaelvex has brought shame upon our bloodline long enough, the patriarch announced in a voice that rumbled like thunder. He will be culled before the next cycle to preserve the purity of our genetic heritage, and his name will be erased from our records as if he never existed. The gathered Vorathi nodded their approval because this was proper, and this was tradition, and this was the way things had always been done. I invoke the right of mentorship claim, a voice called out from the back of the chamber. Every head turned to see the human woman standing there, with no fear on her face, despite being surrounded by creatures that could kill her in seconds. The patriarch's markings flickered with surprise, and then with anger. "You dare invoke ancient law, human," he demanded. "I do," Alara said calmly. "The Galactic Compact recognizes the right of mentorship claim, which allows any citizen to take legal guardianship of a condemned youth if they believe that youth has value the condemning party has failed to see, and I am exercising that right now for the one you call Kaelvex." The chamber erupted in outrage as warriors roared their displeasure at this insult to their traditions. But the patriarch raised one massive claw, and silence fell immediately. "You would take our garbage?" he asked with contempt dripping from every word. "You would claim a defective runt that even his own mother refused to look upon?" Alara met his gaze without flinching. "If he is worthless to you," she said, "then you will not mind if I take him." The patriarch stared at her for a long moment, and something that might have been curiosity flickered in his ancient eyes before it was replaced by cold dismissal. "Take him then, human," he said with a wave of his claw. "Take our trash and let the galaxy see what foolishness your species is capable of. But know this, he will never be Vorathi again, and if he ever returns to our territory, he will be killed on sight." "Understood," Alara said. She turned and walked out of the chamber without looking back, and the Vorathi watched her go with expressions that mixed confusion and contempt in equal measure. No one had ever wanted their broken things before. Alara found Kale still lying in the training pit where they had left him, and she knelt beside him and pressed a medical patch to the worst of his wounds. His eyes opened slowly and focused on her face with suspicion and fear, and something else that might have been desperate hope. "Who are you?" he managed to ask through the pain. "My name is Alara Vance," she said, "and I just saved your life, though I suspect you will hate me for it before you thank me." "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you want something broken?" Alara looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "Because I do not see something broken," she said. "I see something unfinished, and where I come from, we have a long history of finishing what others have given up on." She helped him to his feet and supported his weight as they walked slowly out of the training grounds and toward the docking bay where her ship waited. Behind them, the Vorathi went back to their lives and forgot about the runt they had discarded. They had no idea what they had just unleashed upon the galaxy. The ship was called the Adamantine Hope, and it was an old human military frigate that had been decommissioned years ago, but still flew true through the darkness between stars. Kale sat in the medical bay with bandages wrapped around his chest and arms, and watched the human woman move around the room with careful efficiency. He did not understand what was happening to him. Among his people, the weak were discarded or killed, or used as examples of what not to become, and he had expected this human to do the same in whatever strange way humans did such things. But she had given him food instead. Real food, not the scraps that the other Vorathi youth had left for him to fight over, but actual prepared meals that she placed in front of him without comment or condition. She had given him a room of his own, with a bed that was too small for a full-sized Vorathi but perfect for him. And she had given him medical care and time to heal, and something he had never experienced before in his entire life. She had given him patience. 3 days passed before she finally sat down across from him and began to speak. "You are confused," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Kale admitted. I do not understand what you want from me. What do you think I want? He struggled to find the words, because he had no framework for this kind of conversation. Vorathi take slaves sometimes, he said slowly, from conquered worlds, but they are usually strong and useful, and I am neither of those things, so I do not know why you would want me as a slave. You are not my slave, Alara said firmly. You are my student if you choose to be. Student, the word felt strange in his mouth. I am going to teach you things, she explained, and then you will decide what to do with what you have learned. Why? He asked again, because the question burned inside him and would not stop. Alara leaned back in her chair and looked at him with those strange brown eyes that held no bioluminescence, and yet somehow seemed to see everything. Let me show you something, she said. She activated a screen on the wall and images began to appear, moving pictures from a world he had never seen. He saw a blue planet covered in water and green growing things, and he saw creatures that moved across frozen white landscapes in packs. These are wolves, Alara said. They are predators from my homeworld, and they hunt by working together and never giving up, and they will chase prey for hours until that prey cannot run anymore. The images changed to show creatures that looked like primitive versions of Alara, naked and holding simple weapons. And these are my ancestors, she continued. They were not the strongest creatures on our world, and they were not the fastest, and they did not have claws or fangs or venom, but they became the dominant species anyway. Kale watched the primitive humans tracking large animals across vast plains, following them day after day until the animals collapsed. How? He asked. Persistence, Alara said. My people learned that we did not need to be the strongest or the fastest. We just needed to be the thing that never stopped coming, the thing that would still be there after everything else had given up, and that made us more terrifying than any predator with claws. She turned off the screen and looked at him directly. Your people saw your small size and your weak claws and they decided you were defective, she said. But I see something different. What do you see? I see a Vorathi with lower mass, which means greater agility and speed, and I see underdeveloped claws that are compensated by hypersensitive nerve clusters that can detect vibrations through solid surfaces, and I see bioluminescence that can be trained to mask your presence instead of announcing it. Kale stared at her in shock, because no one had ever described his flaws as potential advantages before. Your people trained you to be something you were never meant to be, Alara said. They tried to make you a hammer when you were always meant to be a scalpel, and when you failed to be what they wanted, they threw you away instead of recognizing what you actually were. And what am I? He asked in a voice that trembled despite his efforts to control it. You are a perfect ambush predator, she said, and I am going to help you become exactly that. The training began the next day. Alara did not teach him to fight like a Vorathi, because fighting like a Vorathi had never worked for him and never would. Instead, she taught him human combat doctrine, and it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. She taught him about biomechanics, about how every species had weak points where their muscles connected to their bones, where their nerves clustered together, where a small amount of force applied precisely could disable even the largest opponent. She taught him about pressure points and joint locks, and how to use an enemy's momentum against them. She taught him about psychology, about how most fighters expected their opponents to behave in certain ways, and how those expectations could be exploited and turned into weapons. Your people fight with honor and direct confrontation, Alara explained during one of their sessions. They announce themselves with their bioluminescence, and they charge straight at their enemies because they believe that is the only proper way to fight. It is the Vorathi way, Kale said. And it is predictable, Alara countered. Every species in the galaxy knows exactly what to expect when they face a Vorathi warrior, which means every species has developed counters and strategies and ways to survive, but they have never encountered a Vorathi who fights like a human. She showed him combat recordings from human military archives, footage of human soldiers facing larger and stronger opponents, and winning through tactics and misdirection, and sheer stubborn refusal to stay down. "They trained you to roar," Alara said as she faced him in the training room. "I am going to teach you to be silent." She came at him then, and even though she was smaller and weaker than any Vorathi, she put him on the ground in 3 moves. "Again," she said. He got up and she put him down again. Again. This pattern repeated for hours until every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he did not stop because he was beginning to understand something important. He was beginning to understand that everything he had been taught about strength and power was incomplete. Strength meant nothing if you could not land a blow, and power meant nothing if your opponent was never where you expected them to be. When the session finally ended and Kale lay gasping on the floor of the training room, Alara knelt beside him. "You have potential," she said, "but potential is just the beginning, and the road ahead will be harder than anything you have faced before, and there will be moments when you want to give up." "I will not give up," he said through his exhaustion. She smiled at him, and it was the first time he had seen a human smile, and there was something warm in it that he did not fully understand. "Good," she said, "because giving up is not something we teach here." She helped him to his feet, and they walked together toward the mess hall for food. "What will I become?" Kale asked as they walked. "If not a Vorathi warrior, then what?" Alara considered the question for a long moment. "Something new," she finally said. "Something the galaxy has never seen before. Something that will make your former people regret the day they threw you away." For the first time since he could remember, Kale felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, and he held onto it like a drowning man holds onto a rope. Months passed in a blur of pain and progress and endless repetition, as the adamantine hope traveled through the far reaches of space. Alara took Kale to remote moons where they ran through forests until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to collapse, and she took him to asteroid belts where they practiced combat in zero gravity, and she took him to abandoned stations where they played endless games of hunter and prey in the darkness. Every day brought new challenges and new lessons. She taught him how to control his breathing so that he made no sound even when moving at full speed. And she taught him how to mask his bioluminescent markings by controlling the flow of chemicals through his body. And she taught him how to read the subtle signs of an opponent's body that revealed their next move before they made it. She introduced him to human weapons, not the massive blades and crushing hammers that the Vorathi favored, but precision instruments designed for specific purposes. The monomolecular wire was thin as a hair and strong enough to cut through armor, and it could be concealed anywhere and deployed in an instant. The neural disruptor was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand and could shut down an opponent's nervous system with a single touch. And then there were the simpler weapons, the throwing knives that Alara could plant in a target from 20 meters away, the garrots made of braided metal cord, the poison needles disguised as jewelry. "Your people believe that a warrior's worth is measured by the size of his weapons," Alara said during one of their training sessions. "Humans learned long ago that the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming." Kale absorbed everything she taught him with a hunger that surprised them both. But it was not just his body that was changing. Alara spent hours talking to him about human philosophy and human history, about how her species had risen from nothing to spread across the stars despite being physically inferior to most of the aliens they encountered. She taught him about strategy and long-term thinking, about how humans had won wars not through single decisive battles, but through patience and planning, and the willingness to sacrifice today for victory tomorrow. A Vorathi sees a wall and tries to break through it. she said one evening as they sat in the ship's observation lounge watching stars drift by. A human sees a wall and looks for another way around. That seems like cowardice, Cale said, though his voice held less conviction than it once would have. Does it? Alara asked. If the goal is to reach the other side, does it matter how you get there? The Vorathi who breaks through the wall has wasted energy and possibly injured himself, and the human who walked around the wall is fresh and ready for whatever comes next. Cale thought about this for a long time. My people would say the Vorathi has proven his strength, he finally said. And my people would say the human has proven his intelligence, Alara replied. Strength fades with age and injury, but intelligence remains until the day you die. 6 months into the training, Cale broke. It happened on a frozen moon where Alara had left him alone for 3 days with minimal supplies as a survival exercise, and when she returned to pick him up, she found him huddled in a cave with his arms wrapped around his knees. He was not physically hurt, but something inside him had cracked open. I cannot do this, he said when she sat down beside him. I am not what you think I am. I am just garbage that my people threw away. I am genetic waste that should have been culled at birth. I am nothing. His voice rose as years of pain and rejection poured out of him like poison from a wound. They were right about me, he shouted. I will never be strong enough. I will never be good enough. I will always be Kethshar. I will always be the Hollow Fang, and you are wasting your time trying to make something out of nothing. Alara sat beside him in silence and let him scream until there was nothing left. When he finally fell quiet, she spoke. Are you finished? He looked at her with exhaustion and shame in his eyes. I am sorry, he whispered. Do not apologize, she said. This was necessary. What? Everything you just said, all that pain and anger and self-hatred, it has been holding you back since the day we met, and you needed to let it out before we could move forward. She put a hand on his shoulder, and the warmth of it surprised him because he had never known physical contact that was not violent. You are not garbage, she said firmly. You are not genetic waste, and you are not Kethshar. Then what am I? You are someone who was failed by the people who should have protected him, Alara said. You are someone who was told every day of his life that he was worthless until he believed it, and you are someone who is about to learn that everything they told you was a lie. Cale stared at her, as tears he did not know he could cry fell from his eyes. Now we can start building you into who you choose to be, Alara said. The person who existed before today was shaped by others, by their cruelty and their expectations and their limitations. But the person who emerges from this cave will be shaped by you and you alone. They left the moon the next day, and something was different. Cale trained harder than ever before, but there was a focus in him now that had not been there before, a quiet intensity that replaced the desperate need to prove himself. He stopped trying to be a Vorathi warrior and started being something else entirely. His movements became fluid and silent, and his strikes became precise and devastating, and his ability to disappear into shadows grew until Alara herself sometimes lost track of him during their exercises. He learned to control his bioluminescence completely, dimming it to nothing when he wanted to hide, and flashing it in blinding patterns when he wanted to disorient. He learned to use his smaller size as an advantage, fitting through spaces that larger Vorathi could not and moving faster than their eyes could track. 1 year after she had taken him from Nexus Station Keth 4, Alara stood across from him in the training room and nodded with satisfaction. Attack me, she said. Cale moved, and for the first time, Alara did not put him on the ground. Instead, she found herself on the defensive as he flowed around her guard like water around stone, striking at pressure points and nerve clusters with speed she could barely follow. She managed to block most of his attacks, but not all of them, and when they finally stopped, she was breathing hard and there was a smile on her face. You are ready for the next phase, she said. What is the next phase? You need a new name, Alara said. Kaelvex was the name given to you by people who never saw your worth, and Kethshar was the insult they used to diminish you, but neither of those names belongs to who you have become. She looked at him with pride in her eyes. From now on, your call sign is Spectre, she said, because you are a ghost that moves unseen and strikes without warning, and by the time your enemies know you are there, it is already too late. Spectre considered the name and felt it settle into his soul like a key fitting into a lock. Spectre, he repeated, and his bioluminescence pulsed once in acknowledgement. Alara extended her hand in the human gesture of respect between equals. Welcome to the next level of your training, Spectre, she said. The galaxy is not ready for what you are about to become. He took her hand, and for the first time in his life, he believed that he might actually become something worth being. 3 years had passed since the day Alara Vance had walked into the halls of Clan Kethfer and claimed a broken runt that no one wanted. And in that time, the galaxy had continued to turn, and wars had been fought and empires had risen and fallen. But now Spectre was returning to where it all began. Nexus Station Keth 4 looked exactly as he remembered it, a massive metal structure floating in the darkness of space where thousands of aliens lived and traded and fought. And as the adamantine Hope docked at one of the outer ports, Spectre felt something stir in his chest that might have been anticipation or might have been dread. Word of his return had spread faster than they expected. Within hours of their arrival, a messenger from Clan Kethfer appeared at their ship with a formal declaration written on traditional bone parchment. The Patriarch had heard that their discarded runt had returned bearing human markings and human weapons and human training, and this corruption of sacred Vorathi blood could not be tolerated. A challenge had been issued. The Kethvoran was the most ancient and sacred ritual of the Vorathi people, a duel to the death that could only be refused at the cost of eternal dishonor. Spectre read the declaration and then looked at Alara. I have to accept, he said. I know, she replied. Are you ready? He considered the question carefully before answering. I have been ready for 2 years, he said. I was just waiting for the opportunity. The arena was a vast circular pit carved into the heart of the station, where Vorathi had settled their disputes with blood for generations. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing galleries above, their bioluminescent markings creating a sea of pulsing light as they watched and waited. Alara stood at the edge of the pit with her arms crossed and her face calm despite the hostile glares being directed at her from every direction. She was the only human in the entire arena, possibly the only human on the entire station, and she did not show a flicker of fear. The Patriarch himself sat on an elevated throne overlooking the pit, his ancient markings burning with cold fire as he watched the proceedings. Today we cleanse the stain upon our bloodline, he announced in a voice that echoed throughout the arena. The one called Kaelvex, who was cast out for his weakness and corruption, has returned to face Vorathi justice. The crowd roared their approval. His opponent will be Thalrex, champion of Clan Kethfer, undefeated in 37 battles, the pride of our people. Thalrex entered the arena to thunderous cheers, and he was everything a Vorathi warrior was supposed to be. He stood nearly 9 feet tall with muscles that bulged beneath his dark skin, and his claws were fully extended and gleaming with fresh oil, and his bioluminescent markings blazed so bright they cast shadows across the arena floor. He looked up at the galleries and raised his arms in triumph, already certain of his victory. Then Spectre entered. The crowd fell silent in confusion as they watched the small figure walk into the pit with quiet confidence. He wore no armor and carried no visible weapons, and his bioluminescence was dimmed to almost nothing, and he moved with a fluid grace that was completely unlike the powerful stride of a traditional Vorathi warrior. Thalrex laughed when he saw his opponent. This is the great corrupted warrior, he called out to the crowd. "This is the threat that the Patriarch summoned me to destroy. He is even smaller than I remember." He turned to face Spectre directly, and recognition flickered in his eyes. "I remember you, Kethshar," he said with a cruel smile. "I remember how you cried when I cut you open in the training pit, and I remember how you crawled away like a broken animal." Spectre said nothing. "Today I will finish what I started all those years ago," Thalrex continued. "And when I am done, there will be nothing left for your human master to bury." Spectre still said nothing, and his silence seemed to unsettle Thalrex more than any response could have. The Patriarch raised his claw, and the arena fell completely silent. "Begin," he commanded. Thalrex charged with all the fury and power of a Vorathi champion, his claws slashing in devastating arcs that would have torn any normal opponent to pieces. But Spectre was not there. He had moved the instant the command was given, sliding to the left with a speed that Thalrex could not track, and by the time the champion's claws cut through empty air, Spectre was already behind him. A strike to the nerve cluster at the base of Thalrex's spine made his left leg buckle. The champion roared in rage and spun around, but Spectre was already moving again, flowing around the larger warrior like water around a stone. Another strike, this time to the pressure point beneath Thalrex's right arm, and suddenly the champion could not lift his claws above his shoulder. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their greatest warrior stumbled and staggered, while the small figure danced around him like a shadow. Thalrex tried everything he had been taught, every technique that had served him in 37 victorious battles, but nothing worked. Every attack was dodged or redirected. Every defense was bypassed. Every moment brought new pain as Spectre methodically dismantled him piece by piece. 60 seconds into the fight, Thalrex could barely stand. 90 seconds in, he collapsed to his knees with his arms hanging useless at his sides and his bioluminescence flickering wildly with pain and fear, and something he had never experienced before. He was experiencing defeat. Spectre stood before him, completely untouched, his breathing calm and steady. "Finish it," Thalrex gasped. "Kill me and end this shame." The arena held its breath. According to Vorathi tradition, Spectre had every right to kill his defeated opponent, and no one would have blamed him for doing so after everything Thalrex had done to him. Instead, Spectre leaned close and spoke in a voice so quiet that only Thalrex could hear. "I am what your cruelty created," he said. "I am everything you feared I could never be, and I am the proof that your traditions are built on lies." He straightened up and looked down at the broken champion. "But I am not like you," he said. "I do not need to kill to prove my worth, and I will not become the monster that you tried to make me." He turned and walked away, leaving Thalrex alive but utterly defeated on the arena floor. The silence that followed was deafening. No one knew how to respond to what they had just witnessed, because it violated everything they understood about combat and honor, and what it meant to be Vorathi. Spectre walked to where Alara stood at the edge of the pit, and she smiled at him with pride in her eyes. "That was well done," she said quietly. "I almost killed him," Spectre admitted. "Part of me wanted to very badly." "I know," Alara said. "That is what makes your choice meaningful." The Patriarch rose from his throne, and his voice boomed across the arena. "This duel is concluded," he announced, and there was something in his voice that might have been uncertainty. "The challenge has been answered." He said nothing else because there was nothing else to say. Spectre had won, and his mercy was more devastating than any killing blow could have been because it proved that he was not just stronger than their champion. He was better than their entire way of life. As Spectre and Alara left the arena, the whispers began to spread through the crowd. Word of what had happened would travel across the galaxy within days, and the legend of the Spectre would begin to grow. But for now, Spectre simply walked beside his mentor, and felt something he had never felt before in this place. He felt free. 6 months after the duel that shook Nexus Station Keth 4, the name Spectre had become something spoken in whispers across a dozen star systems. Pirates who preyed on cargo ships in the outer territories began avoiding certain sectors entirely after 3 of their bases were dismantled overnight without warning, and the survivors spoke of a shadow that moved through their ranks like death itself, a Vorathi who fought nothing like a Vorathi and left no trace behind. Slavers who trafficked in stolen lives found their operations collapsing as key lieutenants disappeared, and carefully hidden facilities were exposed to authorities, and those who tried to fight back discovered too late that they were not facing something they could fight. Criminal empires that had stood for generations crumbled in weeks, and warlords who had terrorized entire planets suddenly found themselves alone and vulnerable as their networks were surgically cut apart. And through it all, the stories grew. Some said Spectre was a ghost, an angry spirit of a murdered Vorathi who had returned from death to seek vengeance. Others said he was a human experiment gone wrong, a hybrid creature created in some secret laboratory. A few who knew the truth said he was something far more terrifying than either of those things. He was proof that the galaxy's most fearsome predators had been wasting their potential for 10,000 years. The adamantine Hope had become a known vessel in certain circles, a ship that brought hope to the desperate and fear to the cruel, and Alara Vance had become known as the human who somehow turned broken things into weapons. One evening, as the ship traveled through the quiet space between populated systems, Spectre found Alara in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars. He sat down beside her as he had done hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different somehow. "I received a message today," Alara said without looking away from the window. It was from a Vorathi ambassador. Spectre's markings flickered with surprise. "The Patriarch wants you back," Alara continued. "He is willing to pay any price, restore your honor, give you command of a war fleet, make you a hero of your people." Spectre was silent for a long moment as he absorbed this information. "What did you tell them?" he finally asked. Alara turned to look at him with a smile on her face. "I told them you are not for sale," she said. "I told them you never were, and I told them that is something your people never understood about either of us." "Thank you," Spectre said. "For what?" "For knowing what I would want without having to ask." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars drift by. "Can I ask you something?" Spectre said eventually. "Of course." "Why did you save me? The real reason, not the lessons you wanted to teach or the philosophy you wanted to prove, but the actual reason why you walked into that chamber and claimed a broken runt that no one wanted." Alara considered the question for a long time before she answered. "Because I saw myself in you," she finally said. Spectre's markings flickered with confusion. "When I was young, I was told I would never be a soldier," Alara explained. "I was too small, too weak, too female in an organization that did not value women, and everyone expected me to fail and wash out and disappear into some quiet civilian life." She laughed softly at the memory. "I proved them wrong, but the process of proving them wrong nearly killed me, and there were so many nights when I lay awake wondering if they were right, if I was just fooling myself, if I should just give up and accept my limitations." "But you did not give up," Spectre said. "No, I did not, but I almost did, and the only thing that saved me was one instructor who saw something in me that no one else could see, a woman named Commander Tors who took me aside and told me that my size and my struggles did not make me weak. They just meant I had to find a different way to be strong." Alara looked at Spectre with warmth in her eyes. "When I saw you in that training pit, being torn apart by warriors who could not see your value, I remembered what it felt like to be dismissed and discarded, and I decided that I would be for you what Commander Tors was for me." Spectre felt something move in his chest that he did not have words for. Humans have a saying, Alara continued. We say that we see potential where others see waste, and it is why we are still here despite everything the galaxy has thrown at us. It is why we spread across the stars when every other species said we were too soft and too slow and too fragile to survive. She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. We do not believe in broken, Spectre. We only believe in unfinished. Spectre's bioluminescence pulsed slowly in a pattern that meant gratitude and love, and understanding all mixed together. Then perhaps, he said quietly, I will spend my life teaching others what you taught me. Ilara smiled. That sounds like a worthy purpose. In the weeks that followed, word began to spread of something new happening in the galaxy. There were reports of other outcasts being found and rescued, younglings from various species who had been discarded by their own people for being too small or too different or too weak. A Crethian with a damaged wing who could not fly was seen training with Spectre on a remote moon. A Veloxian whose voice box was malformed and could not produce the sonic attacks her species relied upon was observed learning human combat techniques. A young Gorath whose shell had never hardened properly was discovered operating as an intelligence gatherer in the criminal underworld, passing information to authorities and helping to bring down trafficking networks. They called themselves the Unfinished, and they operated in the shadows where no one expected to find threats. The galaxy's powers began to take notice. Some were worried about this new faction and what it might mean for the established order. Others were intrigued by the possibilities of what humans and their allies might be able to accomplish. The Vorathi watched with something that might have been regret as they realized how many potential warriors they had discarded over the generations, how much strength they had thrown away, because it did not fit their narrow definition of power. One day, a young Vorathi female arrived at the Adamantine Hope-seeking asylum. She was small for her kind, and her markings were irregular, and she had been marked for culling by her clan. Spectre met her at the airlock, and saw the same fear and desperate hope in her eyes that Alara must have seen in his all those years ago. I heard you help people like me, the young female said. I heard you take the broken ones and make them into something new. Spectre looked at her for a long moment, remembering everything he had been through and everything he had become. You are not broken, he said. You are just unfinished, and if you are willing to work harder than you have ever worked before, we can help you become what you were always meant to be. The young female's markings flickered with hope. What will I become? She asked. Spectre smiled, and it was an expression he had learned from Alara, one that spoke of warmth and determination and the promise of better things to come. That is for you to decide, he said. We will just help you get there. He stepped aside to let her board the ship, and as he did, he looked up at the stars and thought about how far he had come from the training pit where he had bled and suffered. He had been garbage once, discarded by his own people and left to die. Now he was something else entirely. He was a teacher and a warrior, and a symbol of what could be achieved when someone refused to accept that broken meant worthless. And somewhere out there in the vast darkness between the stars, there were others like him waiting to be found, waiting to be told that they had value, waiting for someone to see their potential instead of their flaws. Spectre intended to find every single one of them. The galaxy had mocked the predator cub, and a human had turned him into a living weapon. Now that weapon would forge others like itself, and the galaxy would never be the same again.